Professor Wang, we're so delighted that you can join us today, and I will now pass the time to you. Professor Wang, please.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the GIFT for organizing this event and inviting me to give this talk. Though I have not enough preparations for it, I hope I can do something. I also look forward to listening to other friend ideas. So in 2020, there was an art exhibition in China called 2020 Plus. This means that there were some completely different conditions for the development after the 2020. When someone asked me at that time, what is the uniqueness of these years in the pandemic, I think at least the three characteristics. The first, of course, is its scale and speed. That it started from one place and quickly spread to all places with global involvement. The length of time and the breadth of spread are unprecedented. Without the conditions of globalization, the pandemic will not happen at such a speed and a scale. So it is impossible to discuss the pandemic without thinking about the contradictions contained in the globalization process. Secondly, the pandemic crisis is not a single crisis, it's not a simple public health crisis, but also a chain of a series of crises. The pandemic has triggered or accelerated the other existing crises and triggered new ones. So it is not only a public health crisis, it's also a crisis of geopolitics, social relations, and so on and so forth. Of course, the current, for example, the war is not necessarily the direct result of the pandemic, but obviously happened in these new conditions. It has also triggered a large-scale economic and a social political crisis. Obviously, when we talk about the poverty alleviation, so these pandemic situation will create the new difficulties for maintaining and to continue that process. So all kinds of the social crises are involved at the same time and interchange in this moment. Third, I think these chain crises highlight a contradiction. That is the contradiction between the old language and the new conditions. So what kind of the language we can describe this situation. So the spread of the virus lead to the different ways of protection. We need a community, a unit, or an organization, and a country to protect it. That is to say, the pandemic has redefined the community and the communities. The crisis is global, but the protection mainly occurs within the framework of nation state, though we have some international cooperation, but still not enough at all. We clearly know that it is impossible for a single country to be immune, but in fact, globally, the prevention of the pandemic situation is still the country-centered. How to define the crisis in these new ideas and new languages is a big problem. Since the end of the Cold War, there have been two most prominent themes. One is, of course, the end of history, and another is clash of civilizations, one after another. However, if observed under today's conflict conditions, the defects and the weakness of these two descriptions are completely exposed. As far as Asian region is concerned, since the 19th century, Northeast Asia has been undergoing drastic change continuously. This change is actually a part of the continuous change since the Europe entered the era of great navigation in the 16th century. The whole conflict in this era contains two main features. The first feature is that from the 19th century or even earlier, the competition among big powers in this region is a continuous phenomenon. In the early days, there were conflicts between the Britain and Russia, Japan and Russia. Then there were conflicts between Japan and United States, competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And then there was the rise of China and India, and all of which were constantly changing. Therefore, in the sense of geopolitics, we can regard this geopolitical crisis as the continuation of the conflicts between the major powers that have spread to this day and have not been completely finished, though the situation changed fundamentally, but still you can see certain kind of continuation. We can look at this area from a long perspective. The new phenomenon is that with the changes in 19th century, especially in the 20th century, the industrialization conditions in Northeast Asia, which are rare in other non-Western regions, have become more and more important in the global economy and the politics. Today, the second largest economy, the third largest economy, and as well as 12th largest economy are all gathered in this area. If we add up the GDP of China, Japan, and South Korea, it already accounts for a considerable part of the global economy. It's higher than the EU. Plus India's recent rapid growth, this is an unprecedented phenomenon. From the perspective of geopolitics, this is a major change in the past 500 years in some way. And the shift of the geopolitical center of gravity is taking place. This is the first question that we need to discuss and think about. However, the increase of this region in global economy has not changed all the track of competitions for some kind of the domination, the hegemony, and so on and so forth, and not result in a real Asian solidarity. Here there were different reasons. Now I think it's maybe I can cite the Anthony Blinken's the administration's approach to People's Republic of China, which published in the May 26th this year, in which he said, to build such a future, we must defend and reform the rule-based international order, the system of laws, agreements, principles, and institutional mechanisms that the international community built together after the two world wars to govern relations between nations, to prevent conflict and uphold the rights of all, and so on and so forth. You talk about, refer to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the charters of the UN, and it's on the surface. This rhetoric is similar to the Bandung Conference, because we all refer to this declaration and the charters, but the connotation is very different. So we read his the documents. It continued. Even as President Putin's war continues, we will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China. According to this document, 3 keywords for the purpose of maintaining US hegemony, that's invest, align, and compete. Invest and the value chain, the related to the infrastructure, education, technology, and under the national program. These investments will not only make Americans stronger, according to him, but will make us a stronger partner and ally. The Republican Senator Todd Young, co-sponsor of the Chip and Science Bill, he said that the nation that wins the race in key technology areas will be the superpower of the future, and we cannot afford to lose this race. So these mean that the issues of investment, even related to mainly domestic, the economic policy, but it's internationally speaking, it's talking about the competition for the maintain the superpower. So the second key alliance. So here is the line is really another phenomenon. So what we can see is that the U.S. now in this region, U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, U.S.-South Korea Security Alliance, looming a non-NATO partner, even maybe Taiwan or something, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, the Quad Leaders Summit, Japan, India, and the U.S., and also Indo-Pacific, the Partnership for Maritime Domain of Wealth. These are the U.S.-Asian Summit, AUKUS, and the U.S.-EU Trade Technology Council, and so on, and a certain kind of the globalized, the NATO, because now they try to invite the nations from this region to the summit. And the last one is competition. Ensuring our military remains, I quote here, ahead, we will seek to preserve the peace through a new approach we call the integrated deterrence, including allies and partners working across the conventional nuclear space and information domain, and draw great strength from our mutually reinforcing economic, technological, and diplomatic spheres. So these are the very important phenomena. So still keep going. It's new, but it's not completely new. So the second feature of this area is the juxtaposition. So according to the above description of multiple heritages, that is to say the colonial heritage has spread to this day and still affects the area. The Cold War and the post-Cold War, none of these legacies is completely ended. The colonial legacy, the legacy of the Cold War, and the legacy of post-Cold War have all changed, but remained in this place. This is an area with multiple contradictions and multiple historical relationships. Globally, the conclusion of the end of the history assumes the contradiction between the past social systems, mainly the end of contradiction between the capitalism and the socialism. But we can see that all kinds of the new social conflicts are being repackaged with old ideology. And it seems that the more hegemonic countries led and dominated, mainly by the United States, the more emphasis they put on the ideology. In this sense, the old form of ideological wars has gone, but the discussion of so-called the end of ideology seems to have ended too. So among the juxtaposition crisis I mentioned earlier, one of the most striking features in Asia is juxtaposition of the Cold War and the post-Cold War. The juxtaposition of the two has the most direct influence on this area. The contemporary world order was formed by the end of the socialist system and the end of the Cold War. We often talk about the end of the Cold War, but in fact, in East Asia, Cold War actually have not completely ended, though the large changed after the Chinese reform, that the Sino-Japanese relations, Sino-Southeast Asian relations, the Sino and the South Korean relations much improved. In this context, we may revisit, not repeat, the Bandung Spirit. I would like to summarize the Bandung Spirit in 3 terms. It's also 3 keywords, maybe, that in contrast to Blinken's 3 keywords to compare. The first is a solidarity rather than the alliance. So here I want to cite the President Sukarno's opening address to the Bandung conference at that time. He said that we are all united by something more than what seems to divide us. For example, we are united by our shared aversion to colonialism in whatever form. We are united by a shared aversion to racism. We are united by the shared determination to maintain and stabilize world peace. So here is talking about the solidarity rather than the alliance, the solidarity non-aligned. And these were the comparison. The second is peace, to talk about the peace rather than the competition for maintaining the hegemony. The Asia and African countries, I hear the Zhou Enlai's speech. He said that in the conference, he said that the Asian and African people feel more deeply the value of world peace and the value and the national independence. Based on these circumstances, it is necessary for Asia and African people to ensure world peace, strive for and maintain a national independence, and promote the friendly cooperation among nations for these purposes. It is not the common aspiration of the people of all countries. So the third is a cooperation rather than ally, of course. So it's a non-aligned movement, but for the cooperation rather than the ally or the ally. The cooperation is based on the respect for the independence or the autonomy for each countries or the nations and the cooperation for that. So it's also the Zhou Enlai said that we demand not only political independence, but also economic independence. Of course, we demand the political independence not to adopt a policy of exclusion towards the countries outside Asia and Africa. We demand a change in the Western colonialism, the state of the exploitation of the backward countries in the East. So these situations obviously is a change that we are living in a global time. It's not a nation state and also not in the highway of the national liberation movement. But still, we on the one hand, we fall the certain kind of globalization cooperation, but on the other hand, we also need the certain kind of the autonomy. So these are the issues. So in the 10 principles that are published by the Bandung Conference, the fourth reads as not to interfere or interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. And the sixth and the seventh reads as arrangements for collective defense are not used to serve the special interests of any one great power. No country exerts pressure on the other not to violate the territorial integrity or the political independence of any country by acts of aggression or the threat of aggression or the use of forces. So the so-called end of the Cold War was actually not caused by the reconciliation to some extent between the two big powers, of course, but ended with the failure of one side at that time. As a result, the victorious party completely ignored the crisis hidden in its own social systems. If the confrontation between the East and the West camps in the post-war order constitutes the framework of the Cold War, then the Third World movements, including China as a mutual equals with anti-war and anti-hegemonic struggles within the two camps, are the catalyst for the deep Cold War force that has changed this bipolar relationship. Therefore, thinking about the end of Cold War should focus on the long process of the 20th century, not just the historical moment of the US-Soviet reconciliation. the post-war order should be described as a process of ebb and flow between the Cold War and the Cold War, and the end of the Cold War should be described within this complex process. So in that sense, the Asian-African solidarity and the Third World internationalism are not just the derivatives of bipolar hegemony, but a struggle against the hegemony generated and participated in the shaping of post-war international relations. When we talk the multilateral relations, we need to think about what's the one participation from the countries. They are not hegemonic, non-big powers. So in that sense, the middle ground, if we call that one, has its own political dynamism, is no longer a subordinate force in bipolar relations. Summarizing the post-war international order with the model of bipolar hegemony conceals the anti-hegemonic struggle that extends from long wars and revolutions and takes place in the vast middle zones, took place in the vast middle zone, and also conceals those countries that has gradually formed unfinished subjectivity through the long process. So it's obviously, I'm not arguing that we need to repeat what happened in the second half of the 20th century, but we need to think a multilateral the relationship. We also need to rethink about the different nations, and especially those not big powers, but how they could consider their solidarity and play the big role there. So the Bellow Moment is named for the cultural expression of this subjectivity, I think. The Bandung Conference, the non-aligned movement, the anti-colonial and anti-aggression and anti-war, the more peaceful at the moments all over the world, as well as the international, the moment surrounding China's return to the United Nations in the 1970s, have so profoundly reshaped the world structure. In this perspective, the United Nations, which is a symbol of the reconstruction of the post-war world order, is no longer just a tool for the hegemonic control, but also a field of struggles and debates for the international order. Although its normative expression has not changed, it is accompanied by the reorganization of the internal power relations. The universal value embodied in the UN Charter has been highlighted by the impact and the restriction of those, the third world movement or the global south movement on the hegemonic manipulation. So when the more and more calling or the discussion about the reform UN, we also need to think how to reform it from this perspective, rather than from the perspective of the big powers. So we are living in a world without a Bandung and a non-aligned moment, a so-called the collapsing neoliberal globalization, which also implies the tasks of our time, a new international of debt monopolies, definancializations, debt dependency, and the multipolarization or the multilateralism. After the Cold War, we can see that the contemporary world situation is the crisis of geopolitical systems. The first is the crisis of political system marked by the collapse of the socialist system, that is the socialist system in Eastern Europe, represented by the Soviet Union. But with the end of the Cold War crisis and the end of the world system, we can see another crisis. This is also the crisis of the democracy that people are discussing today. That is the system on the winning side, on the Cold War itself, is in crisis. The reason behind the phenomena, often described as so-called populism and so on, is the second crisis. That is the democratic crisis. In this sense, the old language can hardly describe the nature of the political crisis. This state of the exposition represented by the conclusion of history, the democratic and the non-democratic ones, can be said to be an inflationary the language, overused language, and a language with no substantive connotation today. The poor discursive strategy is to use Russia, China together and others to justify the so-called value-oriented diplomacy. The real crisis, I think, is universal for each country, that different from the political systems are facing today. Politically, I call it the representative break. What is the typical fracture? That is, the basic form of political system is out of touch with its social form. We look at the wave of first crisis, the end of the socialist system in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. It is the disconnection between its basic political value and its social form. People can't be the real masters of society, which constitutes a contradiction with the legitimacy of its socialism. Today, the crisis of democracy is also the disconnection between the social political form and the social form, because these forms of political democracy and the voting can't solve the problem of high inequality and the division at the social level, and the problem that the party politics can't represent the opinions of different social groups and so on. The people want to express it directly beyond the framework of party politics. The resulting chaotic situation is often described as the populism, but this populism is fundamentally the product of that political crisis, not the other way around. So it is impossible to grasp to overcome these political crises if we only condemn this populism from the surface instead of analyzing the representative fracture behind it. So in this sense, I think that we are facing the same challenge in different ways. So we need to find the new language to rethink about it. I think I already used all the time of it. So thank you so much.